At 7:42 a.m., on August 17, 1943, the sun was already beating down with relentless intensity over Dodorura airfield in New Guinea. The early morning haze that hung in the air felt like a weight, thick and stifling, as if the tropical humidity had decided to linger in the bloodstream. Beneath the hot, glaring rays, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched, a figure clad in grease-streaked coveralls, eyes narrowed and focused on his task. The sound of the buzzing tropical wildlife, the distant hum of aircraft engines, and the steady rhythm of aircraft maintenance surrounded him as he worked, but his attention was solely on one thing: Lieutenant Robert Hayes. Hayes was preparing for yet another combat mission, one that McKenna feared might be his last. At 23 years old, Hayes had flown only 6 combat missions, yet to score a single kill. His reputation, or rather his lack of it, weighed heavily on him, but it wasn't that which troubled McKenna the most. What worried him deeply was the cruel reality of the war they were fighting and the inherent flaw in the aircraft that Hayes would be flying. Hayes, a farm boy from Iowa, was heading straight into danger, and McKenna knew it. The mission for that day was a standard patrol, the kind that had turned deadly too many times in the past few weeks. The Japanese had launched 18 Mitsubishi A6M0s to intercept the patrol, a formidable force, fast and agile in the skies. The Zeros had already proven their deadly ability to pick off American pilots who were caught unaware, and today, Hayes would be in the thick of it. McKenna had seen too many good pilots die in the same way, killed by the same ruthless enemy tactics. The problem was simple, yet devastating. The P-38 Lightning, the aircraft they relied on, had a fatal flaw. It could not turn fast enough to evade the Zeros. McKenna had been maintaining the P-38 for 8 months. He knew the aircraft inside and out. It was a fighter like no other, with its twin-engine, twin-boom design that made it exceptionally fast in a straight line and a formidable opponent at high altitudes. In many ways, it was the perfect aircraft for long-range combat, capable of reaching speeds over 400 miles per hour and carrying heavy armament. But at lower altitudes, in tight dogfights, it was a different story. The Zero, with its lightweight and nimble handling, could outturn the P-38 with ease. It could snap into a turn in half the time, gaining on its prey with ruthless efficiency. McKenna had seen the results of this disadvantage firsthand. He had watched good men climb confidently into their P-38 seconds, only to never return or return in pieces. The training manuals, the instructors, and the regulations all said the same thing: never engage a Zero in a turning fight. The P-38's strength was in its speed and its altitude. The doctrine was clear: dive in, take a shot, climb out, and escape before the enemy could react. But this doctrine had failed again and again. The Zeros were too clever. They baited American pilots into turns, cut inside the P-38's radius, and shot them down. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38 seconds in the last 6 weeks alone, most of them after getting caught in turning engagements they could not escape. McKenna had lost count of how many pilots he had watched die, good men, young men, just like Hayes. He had heard their final words, felt their last moments pass through the hum of the radio transmissions. Some came back in boxes, others never returned at all. And always, the same fatal flaw: the aircraft couldn't respond quickly enough when it counted. The problem, McKenna knew, wasn't with the pilots. It was with the P-38 itself. The aircraft's aileron control cables, which ran through the twin booms to the tail section and then forward to the wing control surfaces, had a small amount of slack built into them. Just 3/8 of an inch, but that tiny delay, that fraction of a second, was all the Zeros needed to outmaneuver the Americans. At high speeds, it didn't matter. The aircraft handled just fine, but during low-speed turns, those crucial, split-second moments, it was the difference between life and death. McKenna had brought this up to the engineering officer months ago. He had explained the issue and suggested that the control cables be tightened to eliminate the slack. The officer's response was predictable. The tension in the cables was within specifications, and any modification would void the aircraft's warranty. No one, not even a mechanic as experienced as McKenna, had the authority to make such a change. The engineers at Lockheed, 7,000 miles away in California, were the only ones who could approve modifications to the flight control systems. But McKenna couldn't wait for bureaucratic approval while pilots kept dying. By the time McKenna had worked on the P-38 seconds for long enough to notice the slack in the cables, it was too late. The deaths were stacking up, and the young pilots like Hayes were constantly sent into combat without the proper tools to survive. It was a cruel irony. While the pilots followed every regulation and doctrine, it was the aircraft itself that was betraying them. As the days passed, McKenna became more and more determined to find a solution. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the engineers in California to notice the issue. If Hayes and the others were going to have any chance of surviving, something had to change. McKenna knew the risks. He knew that tampering with the aircraft's flight control system could lead to severe consequences, court-martial, dishonorable discharge, even prison time. But at that moment, he didn't care. The lives of the pilots meant more than regulations. So, late one night, after the day's maintenance work had ended and the airfield was quiet, McKenna made a decision that would change everything. He walked into the hangar alone, a tool belt strapped to his waist, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. The other mechanics had already gone to bed, and the air was thick with the smell of engine oil, grease, and tropical humidity. McKenna had seen too many pilots die, and he couldn't sit idly by any longer. The solution was simple, but the stakes were incredibly high. He would remove the slack in the control cables by adding tension. He didn't need to make a massive modification, just a small adjustment to make the P-38 roll faster and more responsively. McKenna knew exactly what to do. He reached into his toolbox and pulled out a piece of piano wire from a damaged P-38 that had been written off 2 weeks earlier. The aircraft had ground-looped and was considered scrap, but McKenna had kept the wire, unsure of its potential use. Tonight, he would put it to work. With pliers in hand, McKenna bent the piano wire into a Z shape. It fought against him, the stiff wire resisting the force of the pliers. His fingers slipped, cutting his thumb on the second attempt. Blood smeared on the wire, making it slippery. But McKenna didn't stop. He wiped the blood off his hands and continued working. His mind focused entirely on the task. After 8 minutes, the tensioner was complete. The piano wire was now a simple solution to a complex problem, a 6-inch modification that could save lives. With the tensioner ready, McKenna began the delicate task of installing it. He removed the inspection panel from Hayes's P-38 and climbed into the tight space beneath the aircraft's left boom. The metal was warm to the touch from the day's sun, but the task ahead of him demanded careful precision. The space was cramped, and he had to work with one hand while holding a flashlight with the other. His shoulder wedged against the boom structure, the sharp edge of the metal biting into his skin. The installation was tricky. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction, but in the dark, his fingers fumbled with the clevis pin. He dropped it, and it bounced somewhere deep within the boom. For 5 minutes, McKenna searched in the dark, his heart racing. He couldn't afford to fail now. Finally, he found the pin and reconnected the cable. The fit was tight, but the modification was in place. He tested the tension by hand, no slack. The aileron moved immediately, just as it should. McKenna cleaned up his tools and wiped the blood from his hands before replacing the inspection panel. He walked out of the hangar at 1:15 a.m., the humid air pressing down on him like a weight. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint hum of Japanese aircraft engines. His stomach tightened, the tension of the unknown pulling at his insides. Hayes was scheduled to fly the next morning. The fate of the mission, and possibly the lives of several pilots, rested on a single modification. McKenna knew the stakes. If it failed, if the modification caused any issues in flight, Hayes would crash and McKenna would be responsible. But if it worked, Hayes might just survive. And so might the others who would follow him into combat. The hours dragged on as McKenna lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. Every moment felt like an eternity. By 6:30 a.m., he was back at the flight line, watching as Hayes's P-38 was fueled and armed for its mission. McKenna's heart raced as Hayes climbed into the cockpit. The plane taxied to the runway, and McKenna stood there, silently watching the young pilot take off. He could only wait now. The P-38 Lightning soared into the morning sky at 7:42 a.m., the roar of its engines cutting through the thick air of New Guinea. McKenna stood at the flight line, his eyes locked on Lieutenant Hayes's aircraft as it climbed. the twin-engine fighter slicing through the clouds like a blade. It was a beautiful sight, a spectacle of power and purpose. But for McKenna, it was laced with a gnawing anxiety. He had modified the aircraft's control cables, breaking every regulation in the Army Air Force's manual. If this failed, if the modification caused an issue, it would cost Hayes his life, and McKenna would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. But if it worked, the aircraft would respond faster, more agile than before, giving Hayes a fighting chance against the deadly Zeros that waited for him in the skies. The modification was simple: a 6-inch piece of piano wire bent into a Z shape and installed as a tensioner on the left aileron control cable. It was a tiny adjustment in the grand scheme of things, but McKenna knew that sometimes small things made the difference between life and death. And today, that difference might be the key to Hayes's survival. McKenna had watched too many pilots climb into their P-38 seconds, confident in their training, only to be cut down by the enemy. He had seen the manuals, heard the briefings, and understood the doctrine. American pilots were told to avoid turning fights with the Zeros, to use speed and altitude to survive. But McKenna knew better than anyone that combat didn't always follow the rules. The Zeros were too crafty. They baited American pilots into turns, getting inside their radius, and they didn't always play by the book. The doctrine that was supposed to protect them had failed, time and time again. As the P-38 seconds gained altitude, McKenna turned and walked toward the operations tent. He passed the familiar faces of the ground crew, the crew chiefs, and the maintenance men, all of them working in their own world, unaware of the quiet tension that had settled over McKenna's shoulders. He wasn't sure if he could bear the weight of what he had just done, but he also knew he had no choice. Hayes had come to him the night before, desperate. "Is there anything you can do?" Hayes had asked, his voice tinged with fear. "I don't care if it's against regulations. I just want a chance." McKenna had seen the look in Hayes's eyes, an intense, raw fear. Hayes knew what awaited him. The Zeros had already claimed the lives of too many pilots. McKenna had tried to reassure him, but words didn't mean much when faced with the reality of aerial combat. So, McKenna had acted. He had made the change without thinking about the consequences, knowing that if he didn't do something, Hayes wouldn't make it back. For the next hour, McKenna paced nervously inside the operations tent, the air thick with the smell of coffee, engine oil, and sweat. He couldn't bring himself to sit. He couldn't bring himself to look away from the sky. Every time a distant aircraft buzzed overhead, McKenna's heart skipped a beat. He knew Hayes was out there now, flying toward the enemy, but whether the modification would work was still a mystery. The hours dragged on. The clock seemed to crawl, each second heavier than the last. By 8:14 a.m., McKenna heard the first reports of the engagement. Hayes's flight had made contact with the Japanese forces over the Huan Gulf. The Zeros had been spotted at 13,000 feet, and the American pilots had begun their dive. McKenna's hands shook as he grabbed the nearest radio, listening intently to the chatter between Hayes's flight and their squadron leaders. There was nothing McKenna could do now but listen. The next few minutes were a blur of static and hurried commands. McKenna heard Hayes's voice crack through the radio, faint but clear. "I've got a Zero in my sights." Then the sound of gunfire crackled, followed by the rapid thud of machine guns. McKenna's pulse quickened. Hayes had taken the first shot. He had engaged the enemy. But had the P-38 responded the way it was supposed to? McKenna had no way of knowing until the pilot came back. At 8:25 a.m., McKenna heard something that made his stomach drop. Hayes's wingman reported, "Hayes is still with the formation. No visual on enemy aircraft." That meant Hayes was still flying, still in the fight. But McKenna had learned not to trust silence on the radio. Too many pilots had gone down without a trace before the chatter stopped. He couldn't let himself get too hopeful yet. The minutes dragged on as McKenna stood by, his eyes fixed on the sky, waiting for any sign of the flight returning. He replayed the events of the night before in his mind, the desperate conversation with Hayes, the way the young pilot had begged him for a chance. McKenna remembered the moment when he had made the decision to break the rules, to make the modification that could get them both court-martialed if anyone found out. But what choice had he had? If he hadn't done it, Hayes would be dead already, and McKenna would never have been able to live with himself. He had made the right call, even if the consequences were unknown. The radio crackled again, and McKenna leaned in. Every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. This time, it was Captain Frank Mitchell's voice, calm but urgent. "Hayes, you've got a 0 coming up fast at 3 o'clock. Brake hard." McKenna's breath caught in his throat. He could almost see it, Hayes, his P-38 turning into the dive, trying to shake off the attacking fighter. McKenna could hear the growl of the engines, feel the pull of gravity as the aircraft plummeted toward the ground. Then, Hayes's voice came through the radio again, but this time it was different. It was louder, more confident. "I've got him. He's inside my sights. I'm going for the shot." McKenna's heart skipped a beat. The words were like a miracle proof that the modification had worked. He had feared the worst, but here was Hayes, calm and in control, doing exactly what he needed to do. The sound of gunfire filled the radio, and a brief burst of static followed. McKenna's mind raced. Did Hayes get the 0? Was it dead? Would Hayes survive this fight? And then, the words came. "Got him. One down. Going after the next." McKenna could hardly believe his ears. Hayes had done it. The modification had worked. Hayes had made his first kill, but there was no time to celebrate. The fight was far from over. The 0 pilots weren't going to give up easily. McKenna stood there, rooted to the spot, as Hayes's voice crackled through the radio once more. 3 down, all within a minute. We've got another one coming in at 6 o'clock. He's coming in fast, but I'm going to turn him. For the next few minutes, McKenna heard the chaotic sounds of battle machine gun fire, radio commands, and the roar of aircraft engines. Hayes's P-38 was moving like a dream, responding faster than McKenna had ever imagined possible. It was as if the aircraft had come alive in Hayes's hands, each movement sharp, precise, and effortless. The modification was working better than McKenna could have hoped. It wasn't just the aircraft that had changed. Hayes himself had found his rhythm. He was no longer a frightened rookie pilot. He was becoming a predator in the sky. The radio chatter grew louder as the dogfight continued, but McKenna was no longer listening to every word. He was watching the skies, waiting for the next sign, the next piece of evidence that Hayes had made it out of this alive. At 9:03 a.m., the P-38 seconds returned to base, their engines roaring as they touched down. McKenna could hardly breathe as he rushed to the flight line, his legs unsteady beneath him. He saw Hayes's aircraft land, the wings still intact, the engine humming smoothly. The plane had come back from the dead just as Hayes had. As the aircraft slowed to a stop, Hayes climbed out of the cockpit, sweat drenched on his flight suit, hands shaking from the adrenaline of the fight. He walked toward McKenna, who was still frozen in place, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. The young pilot's face was flushed with the excitement of the battle. He walked up to McKenna, gave him a quick nod, and simply said, "It worked." McKenna's breath caught in his chest. Hayes had made it. He had survived. The morning of August 17th, 1943, had been nothing short of miraculous for McKenna. His heart had raced through every second of Hayes's mission, and as the final transmission came in, telling him that Hayes had shot down 3 zeros in a matter of minutes, McKenna felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: relief, mixed with the quiet pride of having made a difference, however small. But the mission wasn't over, and neither was the battle. McKenna's heart still pounded as he watched Hayes's P-38 land at Dodorura at 9:03 a.m., the roar of its engines cutting through the air like a distant thunderclap. McKenna had made the modification without anyone's knowledge, a gamble that could have ended in failure and disgrace. But it hadn't. Hayes had made it back alive and had brought down 3 zeros in the process. He hadn't just survived, he had turned the tables on the enemy. As Hayes climbed out of the cockpit, sweat-soaked and shaking, McKenna couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Hayes walked toward him, each step filled with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from having fought and won against the odds. There was no time to waste. Hayes came straight to McKenna, his voice low but intense, eyes locked on the mechanic's face. "It worked," he said, the words simple but full of weight. McKenna nodded, his throat dry. He couldn't speak at first, his mind still reeling from the intensity of the moment. But there was something undeniable in Hayes's voice. The modification had worked. The P-38 had responded faster than it ever had before, turning and snapping through maneuvers with precision. Hayes had flown the aircraft like he'd never flown it before, like it was an extension of himself. McKenna had known the P-38's limitations better than anyone. He had spent countless hours tinkering with it, fixing it, learning its quirks. But the plane had always felt heavy, unresponsive at the critical moments. Now, after the modification, it felt like a new machine altogether. McKenna cleared his throat, the rush of adrenaline still making his heart race. "I just made sure it responded better," he said, his voice rough but steady. He couldn't bring himself to admit the truth that he had broken regulations, used unauthorized materials, and taken a huge risk to make that change. What mattered now wasn't the punishment that could come later. What mattered was that Hayes had survived, and others could too. "Better," Hayes chuckled, but there was a glint of disbelief in his eyes. "Hell, it's like I was flying a fighter, not a truck." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous laugh escaping him. "I didn't know it could do that. I didn't know I could do that." McKenna smiled, though it was more of a grimace than anything else. "You've got the guts, Hayes. Just needed the right tools." The airfield, bustling with activity, seemed to fade into the background. McKenna's attention was fixed on Hayes, who was still catching his breath from the dogfight. Hayes's hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind still processing the fight that had just unfolded. 3 zeros, 3 kills. In a matter of seconds. For a rookie pilot who had never made a kill before, it was a life-changing moment. "What now?" Hayes asked, his voice quieter, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. McKenna didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the other pilots and crew members on the airfield, all going about their business, as if the battle hadn't just been won. They had no idea what had just happened, no idea that McKenna's small, illegal modification had tipped the scales in their favor. Hayes had gone from a nervous rookie to a skilled fighter in the span of minutes, and McKenna knew that the same could happen for the other pilots if only they knew. The silence between them was broken by a sudden shout from across the tarmac. Captain Frank Mitchell, a veteran fighter pilot who had been watching Hayes's engagement from altitude, was striding toward McKenna with a look of stunned disbelief on his face. Mitchell had seen many dogfights in his time, but nothing like this. "What the hell did you do to Hayes's aircraft?" Mitchell demanded, his voice tinged with awe and curiosity. McKenna looked at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he thought about lying, but he knew there was no point. Mitchell had seen the difference in Hayes's performance. He had watched Hayes turn faster, respond more sharply in the dogfight. He'd seen the P-38 behave in ways it wasn't supposed to. Mitchell stopped in front of McKenna and folded his arms, eyeing him intently. "I've been watching that kid fly for weeks," Mitchell said slowly. "He's good, but he's no ace. And what I just saw, that wasn't him. That was a different plane, a different pilot. I've never seen a P-38 roll like that." McKenna swallowed, the weight of the situation beginning to hit him. He knew what was coming next. Mitchell was no fool. He would ask questions until he had answers. But McKenna didn't have the luxury of time to explain. "Nothing official," McKenna muttered, looking around cautiously to make sure no one else could overhear. He lowered his voice to a whisper. "I made a small modification to the aileron cables, just added a little more tension. It eliminated the slack." He avoided Mitchell's gaze, trying not to show how much he was sweating under the pressure. "I know it's against regulations, but it worked." Mitchell's expression softened. He didn't need any further explanation. He had seen the results, and the results spoke for themselves. Hayes had flown with a newfound confidence, taking down zeros in rapid succession. Mitchell's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Do you think it'll work on the rest of the planes?" Mitchell asked, his voice quieter now, more serious. He was no longer questioning McKenna's actions but assessing the potential of the modification. McKenna hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I don't see why not. It only takes a few minutes to do. But you'll have to be careful. We can't get caught." Mitchell thought for a moment, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "Do you think the others would be willing to try it?" McKenna glanced around the airfield. The pilots were preparing for the next mission, checking their aircraft and getting ready for combat. "I think they'd be willing," McKenna said, his voice firm. "They're dying out there. They'll do anything to survive." Mitchell's expression hardened, and a spark of determination flickered in his eyes. "Then we'll do it. I want you to modify my aircraft tonight. I've lost too many good men in the last month to zeros. If this works, we'll spread the word quietly. We won't tell anyone, but we'll get the job done." McKenna nodded, already preparing for what needed to be done. He couldn't let the word spread too quickly. The modification was illegal, and it could get them both in serious trouble. But the lives of the pilots were at stake. The risks were worth it. By the end of the day, McKenna had modified 9 more P-38 seconds. Word spread quickly among the squadron. Some pilots were skeptical, unsure if the change would actually work. Others were more willing to take the risk. Each pilot who flew after the modification returned with a story to tell. They came back with kills. Some made 1, others made 2, and some came back with 3. The kill-to-loss ratio began to shift. It was hard to deny the results. For the first time in weeks, American pilots were coming back from their missions alive. They were turning the tide of the fight in a way that hadn't been possible before, and it all came down to McKenna's simple modification. McKenna didn't want credit. He didn't care about fame or recognition. All he cared about was getting the pilots home. But as the weeks went on, the results became undeniable. Pilots who had been struggling for weeks suddenly found themselves winning dogfights they never thought possible. The Zeros, once so confident in their ability to outmaneuver the Americans, were now starting to falter. They couldn't handle the faster, more responsive P-38 seconds. McKenna never told anyone what he had done. He kept his secret close, even as the modification spread from one aircraft to the next, from one squadron to another. But the results were undeniable. The pilots were surviving, and the kill ratios were improving. It was only a matter of time before someone took notice. By the end of August 1943, the landscape of aerial combat in the Pacific Theater had undergone a subtle yet profound shift. The American pilots of the 5th Air Force, operating out of Dodora Airfield in New Guinea, had been locked in a grueling battle with the Japanese forces for weeks, each day more treacherous than the last. But something had changed in the skies above the island. For the first time in weeks, a sense of cautious optimism started to spread throughout the squadron. The Zeros, once considered invincible in their domain of aerial maneuverability, were no longer as feared. The pilots of the P-38 Lightning, armed with a newfound edge, had begun to return from their missions with kills and, more importantly, with their lives. The kill-to-loss ratio had dramatically improved. It had been nearly 2 weeks since McKenna had made the modification to Lieutenant Hayes's aircraft, the modification that would come to change the course of his squadron's war effort. Hayes, a young rookie with no kills to his name, had returned from his mission with 3 confirmed kills, 3 Zeros shot down in the span of a few minutes. The once skeptical pilots of the squadron had begun to see the difference for themselves. Hayes had flown the same aircraft, but it had responded differently. With the simple modification McKenna had made tightening the slack in the aileron control cables, the aircraft had become something new. It was faster, more agile, more responsive. It was no longer just another heavy fighter. It was a lethal weapon, capable of turning the tide in the air. McKenna's days were filled with the quiet hum of aircraft engines, the constant drone of mechanics and pilots preparing for battle. He spent his nights in the hangar, hunched over the same P-38 seconds, adding the same simple modification to aircraft after aircraft. The process was always the same: a 6-inch piece of high-tensile piano wire bent into a Z shape, inserted into the aileron control system to remove the slack that had made the P-38 sluggish in turns. It was a modification that took only minutes to make, but it changed the lives of the pilots who flew the aircraft. By the time McKenna had modified 9 more aircraft, word had spread throughout the squadron. Pilots were returning with kills, and the stories of the newfound responsiveness of their planes began to circulate. The change was undeniable. The aircraft that had once been a cumbersome, lumbering fighter had become a responsive, agile machine ready to take on the Zeros in a way that the training manuals had never imagined. But as the days passed, the quiet revolution that McKenna had started began to attract the attention of the higher-ups. The engineering officer at Dodorura Airfield began to notice discrepancies in the aircraft's control tensions. The readings were inconsistent. Some aircraft showed slightly higher tensions in their cables than others. At first, it seemed like a trivial issue, nothing to worry about. But as McKenna's modifications became more widespread, it became harder to ignore the changes in the P-38 seconds performance. One evening, As McKenna worked alone in the hangar, the door to the maintenance area creaked open. McKenna looked up, his heart racing, as he saw a familiar figure step inside. It was Lieutenant Colonel Frank Reynolds, the squadron's commanding officer. Reynolds was a no-nonsense officer, a man of discipline and order, and McKenna knew that his visit could only mean one thing. The word had gotten out. Reynolds's sharp eyes scanned the hangar, taking in the scene of mechanics working on their aircraft. When his gaze fell on McKenna, the mechanic's stomach dropped. This was it. The moment had finally come. "McKenna," Reynolds said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." McKenna swallowed, trying to maintain his composure. He wiped his grease-covered hands on a rag, his mind racing with thoughts of what could happen next. He had known that sooner or later the higher-ups would find out. But this moment, the culmination of his risky decision, was unavoidable. Reynolds approached McKenna, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. "There's been talk," Reynolds said, his voice low. "Pilots coming back with higher kill counts, Zeros being shot down at a rate we haven't seen before. You wouldn't happen to know anything about this, would you?" McKenna felt his heart skip a beat. He had been expecting this, but now that it was happening, he didn't know how to respond. The truth weighed heavily on his chest. He couldn't lie, but he didn't want to give the full story either. If Reynolds knew what he had done, McKenna's career, possibly even his freedom, was on the line. "I don't know what you mean, sir," McKenna said, his voice steady, though his mind was spinning. "I've been doing my job, keeping the aircraft in good condition, nothing out of the ordinary." Reynolds didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied McKenna with a calm, unwavering gaze. "We've been checking the planes, McKenna," Reynolds said, "and there's something different. The cable's control tension are off. It's subtle, but it's there, and it's having an effect on how the planes handle." McKenna's heart began to race. He had expected Reynolds to be suspicious, but he hadn't anticipated such a direct confrontation. He kept his voice even, though his hands trembled slightly. "I don't know anything about that, sir. Maybe it's just a difference in the way they were rigged." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "McKenna, don't lie to me. Something's changed, and I want to know what it is." McKenna's mind raced. He couldn't tell Reynolds the truth, not directly. He couldn't afford to have the modification exposed, but there was no way out now. He had to come clean, or this could blow up in his face. "I made a small adjustment to the aileron cables, sir," McKenna admitted quietly. "It wasn't authorized, but the tension was off, and it was affecting the way the planes responded in combat. I just added a little more tension to the cables. It's a simple fix." Reynolds stared at him for a long moment. McKenna could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, as if he were measuring him, calculating his next move. Finally, Reynolds sighed and stepped back. "I knew something was up," he muttered. "You're a good mechanic, McKenna, but you've just broken every regulation in the book." McKenna lowered his head, knowing that he had gone too far, but he also knew that what he had done had saved lives. He had made the right decision, even if it wasn't the lawful one. He could only hope that Reynolds would see that. "You've taken a hell of a risk," Reynolds continued, his voice softer now. "And I don't know whether it's going to come back to bite us, but I'll tell you this: if it works, and we start winning more of these dogfights, we'll find a way to keep it quiet. If it fails—" He paused, his eyes hardening. "We'll deal with the consequences." McKenna nodded, knowing that Reynolds was giving him a chance to continue saving lives without bringing attention to the modification. But that wouldn't be enough. The engineers were already talking. They would eventually find out about the modification, and when they did, McKenna knew they would have to make a choice. Over the next few weeks, the success of McKenna's modification spread throughout the squadron. Pilots who had been skeptical at first began to request the change. They came to McKenna quietly, asking for the modification to be made on their aircraft. They knew it was unofficial. They knew it was against regulations, but they also knew that it worked. One by one, McKenna modified more P-38 seconds, and one by one, more pilots returned with kills. The kill-to-loss ratio began to shift dramatically. By early September, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific were killing Zeros at a rate that had never been seen before. The Japanese, who had once believed their Zeros could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew, were beginning to realize that their advantage had been neutralized. But as word of the success spread, McKenna could feel the pressure mounting. The engineers were getting closer, the higher-ups were starting to take notice, and it was only a matter of time before someone in authority would demand answers. In early October, Lockheed sent an engineering team to New Guinea to inspect the P-38 seconds. They had heard about the changes in performance, but didn't know what had caused them. McKenna could feel the tension building as the engineers began their work. They inspected the aircraft carefully, checking the aileron cables and control systems. McKenna held his breath as they ran their tests, knowing that they would eventually uncover the modification. Finally, after several days of testing, the engineers came to McKenna. The lead engineer, Carl Henson, took a long look at McKenna before speaking. "We've found the issue, McKenna," Henson said. "And we've tested it. The modification works. It's not part of the original design, but it's effective. We'll integrate it into the next batch of P-38 seconds." McKenna felt a surge of relief wash over him. His secret had been discovered, but it was being accepted. The engineers had acknowledged the change, and though it wasn't officially part of the P-38 design, it would be adopted moving forward. McKenna wouldn't be punished. The pilots would continue to fly the modified planes. In the following months, the modification became standard on all P-38 seconds in the Pacific Theater. The pilots who had survived, thanks to McKenna's quick thinking, never forgot him. Though McKenna never received any official recognition, word spread among the veterans of the squadron about the mechanic who had saved their lives.